You quoted the recent KPMG audit as indicating that an 8 or a 10% increase might be sufficient to meet watershed management's needs. The current schedule of rate increases at 12% will likely lead to a significant excess in revenue in coming years if, in fact, those predictions turn out to be correct. And I'd like to know how, and equally as importantly, when you would try to see that value was returned to ratepayers in light of the fact that audit also cautioned against cutting rates in anticipation of that and putting watershed management's credit rating at risk.
Well, there are a number of different ways to do that, and the audit goes into several of them. One is rate stabilization fund, that you would set aside some of that money to guard against a shortage in revenues in the future, so that to the extent that we had a problem like we're having today, we could avoid having to increase rates in the future to offset the shortage. So and what they suggest is $50 million as that fund. So you wouldn't necessarily return that immediately. You could also pay down the debt that's outstanding. So you must then look at the bonds that are outstanding and make sure that that's an appropriate approach and that we don't end up paying penalties that don't make sense in that process. There's also, as they say, pay as you go. There are a number of capital projects that we will continue to fund, as was pointed out by Mr. Bunker, over the coming years. So part of that money could be used to pay for some of that capital expenditure and it would be cheaper that way, because what it would mean is that you don't have to borrow the money, you don't have the cost of funding for that.
Yes, is there one particular one of those options that were suggested in the audit that you yourself favor?
Well, and you can reduce the rates currently. You could use the money to lower the rates now, and so the current beneficiaries of the system will get the benefit of it. I would evaluate a combination of those to see what's most appropriate. Off the top of my head, I don't have a clear answer as to what would be in the best interest of the city. My notion would be to get the proper input that I need to do the evaluation that needs to be done to make sure that whatever we do is going to best serve the ratepayers. But it's not just the question of today's ratepayers. You can reduce rates today, and everybody in this room would be happy. But to the extent that you're not reducing long-term costs, you're just passing it on to a future generation when you have to finance all the capital projects, and then you got the interest that's going to be paid down the road. So I would want to evaluate all of those different options, and then probably would end up with some combination of that.
Well, that's actually a good segue into the next question that I wanted to ask you, which is that the fee structure that we have now between service fees and sales taxes, and also the fee structure that we'll have in the future as these rates are increased, a lot of people are concerned about the equity of that structure, and there are various other fee structures that have been proposed, possibly instituting a stormwater utility fee so as to shift some of the burden away from certain customers onto others. Also the possibility of instituting connection fees or impact fees so that current customers aren't paying for services received by future customers. And you yourself had mentioned just a moment ago that there's also this concern of laying off bills onto future generations. I wonder if you could, I'm sorry, I think, is my microphone doing something funny here? Are we okay? I wonder if you could comment on which, if any, of those sorts of alternative fee structures you're in favor of, and if there are other specific ideas that you have in that regard.
A number of jurisdictions have done the stormwater assessments and the impact fee assessments as a new way of generating revenues for the system to lower the amount of the rates that need to be paid by ratepayers. I would be interested in pursuing all options that would result in increased revenue for the system, and then that would result in a reduction in the rates that are paid by the local ratepayers. So I would investigate all of those, and no preference at present. A number of other jurisdictions have done it successfully. I would be looking for best practices, and I'd see what the impact would be, and then make a decision based on the analysis after getting the appropriate input from the experts in the area.
And do you have an opinion on the equity of the current revenue structure?
Right now, well, of course, to the extent that you can do the municipal option sales tax, it spreads the cost beyond the actual use of the system, and therefore among a broader base. Anybody who pays a sales tax, in fact, end up having to share that. And to the extent that we can collect taxes in that sense, it's a good idea, and especially since it's already in place and that you don't have to increase taxes to do it. But to the extent that there's an excess in costs after you've collected the tax, then where the ratepayer simply must pay it. And that's why I'd be interested in finding as many other new revenue sources as I could to lessen the burden on local ratepayers.
The management of watershed management seems to be serving two masters. The city of Atlanta that seems to view it as sort of a cash cow, someone you can borrow money from, someone who can finance your pet projects, and then the ratepayers, the citizens of Atlanta, who are both the customers and really the equity holders in the system.
Watershed management is a department of the city, and it ought to be delivering the services that it's supposed to deliver in the most efficient, cost-effective fashion. It is not there to fund other operations of the city. It's not serving two masters. The ratepayers are also the people who elect the officials in city government, and so they're serving one and the same. The Department of Watershed Management ought to be subservient to the general elected apparatus of the city, and I do not favor it being a funding source for other city operations, and that's why other people agree with me who've now set up a system pursuant to which the monies that have been expended in the past in other departments, as well as the uncompensated water and sewer services the city has received, will be reimbursed to watershed management. And to the extent that you don't have that type transfer of funding, it means that we were talking earlier about equity. It means that you can maintain more reasonable rates for the ratepayers. If you're funding other departments of the city through the general fund, you ought to be doing that transparently, directly, by assessing them taxes that do that. It's an indirect way to collect funding from the taxpayers, the ratepayers, to fund other operations without being transparent about what you're doing.
Well, then, one specific instance, in 2007, the city directed Watershed Management to transfer $30 million to Atlanta Beltline, Inc. for the Clear Creek Combined Sewer Basin Relief Project. I wonder, what is your opinion of the propriety of that transfer, and if you were mayor and a similar such transfer would be proposed, how you would feel about it?
The city has been transferring those funds, I believe, because of the financial difficulties we're in today, and people were looking for money wherever they could find it. I don't think it's appropriate, as I said earlier, to be transferring money between this enterprise fund and the general fund in that way, because you're robbing Peter to pay Paul without being transparent about it.
It wasn't the general fund.
I understand, but you're still transferring money across, so it's no more appropriate to transfer it to the Beltline than it is to transfer it to the general fund. And to the extent that it's been done, I would insist on it being paid back, just as it's being done with the General Revenue Fund funding.
And then presumably if it were proposed in the future, you would be against it?
Presumably,
when I'm mayor of the city,
we're going to get the financial house in such a great shape that these won't even be issues. So it would never come up.
Okay. About half of the money that's being spent on the capital improvement project is not part of the consent decree, but it's rather discretionary spending. And it's being spent for a variety of reasons, but one of the things that has been put out there to the public is that we're trying to fix the problem of water that's lost in the system. Mm-hmm. And this was sort of initially portrayed as, there's water spilling out of our pipes all over the place. But a significant part of this, maybe even the majority of this, seems to be an accounting error, that the water's in fact being delivered and it just isn't being properly accounted for. And money is being spent to correct that, specifically, at least in one instance, the installation of new water meters. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that that is correcting a problem, it's correcting a problem in billing equity, but it's not saving anybody any money. And as ratepayers as a whole, it's costing us money. And I wonder if you believe that that's an appropriate expenditure, and to what extent you would modify that sort of expenditure.
I think it is a good idea to correct the accounting difficulties. Part of the problem that you're having is that the city has been in the process for several years now of making the transfer from AMR meters, automatic read meters, from traditional meters to automatic read meters. And one of the policies in place is that to the extent that you have a leak with a traditional meter that's scheduled to be replaced by an AMR meter, you don't repair it. Unfortunately, we're not repairing those meters or replacing those meters as quickly as we might, which means that we end up with more water being lost in the meantime. So we either need to increase our ability to repair those meters in a more expeditious fashion, or we must repair them to recoup the lost water.